Well, good afternoon, everybody. I think most people have actually got logged in now, so we can get underway. And let me start by saying welcome. This is the HESES22 training for identifying and counting your students. And this is the second in our, unfortunately, abbreviated series of HESES webinars, a series which is largely intended for people completing HESES for the first time this year, or perhaps who've just come back to it after some time away, need a bit of a refresher. If you missed the previous session, in a moment I'll show you where you can find a recording of that. But let's first of all just start with some housekeeping. So, as I've said, my name is Roger Lear and I work as a funding officer in the funding round team at the OFS. And if my link goes down, then my colleague Ross Lawler will step in to take over from me. He and my other colleague Graham Price are going to be, one or both will be joining us later to respond to your questions. And we'll talk about that in a moment. We've turned on the live transcription feature in Zoom, so captions are available by clicking on the CC icon. These are generated automatically, so sometimes I have trouble with the jargon that we use. Unfortunately, we can't do anything about that. However, the event is being recorded and it will be uploaded to our website and our YouTube channel, and you'll be able to find the link to the recording via our events page on our website, and I'll give you a link for that in a moment. So, as I said earlier, this is intended for those, very much for those who have not really come across HESES before, or those who haven't dealt with it for a while. As I said a moment ago, you can submit questions to us. We'll pause a few times as we go through the slides to answer some of these as we go, and then we should have time at the end for some more. So if you want to give a question to be answered, then please use the Q&A feature of Zoom, rather than the chat feature, which should be used if you need to contact our events team supporting the webinar. Now, technically we're booked and scheduled to go for 90 minutes, but we've got some flexibility over this. And of course, if we can finish early, then we will. And I should mention that we're very keen to get your feedback on these events. So some of you will have signed up to agree to complete an evaluation form when you sign up for these events, and soon after we finished the webinars, which are the last one today, then we'll be sending that out to you. But you can also at any time just write to us, and I'll share an email address for this in just a moment. So just to put this session today into context, as I said earlier, this is the third bullet we're at here, because we'd intended this to be part 3 of a series of 4, but we had to change our plans because of the recent period of national mourning. So this is now the final live event. Unfortunately, we had to cancel the first and last of our usual series, but the content is being made available in recordings. And as you can see from the slide there, those sessions are called Introduction to OFS Funding and HESES22, and that recording is already available, as is the recording for the first live event about categorizing your students. Today's recording will also be available soon after, in a day or two after we finish, and then that will be followed by a recording on the submission and verification of HESES22, which would have been the last event. You can find more information on these and all our events by looking at officeforstudents.org.uk/events, and that will bring us on to talking about supporting material. As usual, we published a lot of supporting material for HESES. I've already just mentioned the recording, and you'll also find the slides that have been used in the presentations. And that's the address again, officeforstudents.org.uk/events. And then specifically on HESES, the best starting point to find HESES resources is this page here, officeforstudents.org.uk/HESES, that's HESES. And I like to read out the addresses here for those that I know rely just on the audio here. So on that page, under the heading supporting documents, you'll find a number of useful things. I actually wasn't expecting that line to come up, but I'll talk about it anyway. We've got the HESES guidance document is linked to from there, but it has its own link here that you can see officeforstudents.org.uk/HESES22. We habitually refer to this as the guidance document. And then on the main HESES page is under supporting documents, we've got some model workbooks, and there's another useful book publication called Completing the HESES22 workbook, and that sort of takes you on a blow-by-blow account through each table in the workbook, each row, each column, and tells you what goes where. So that can be useful, particularly if you're looking at HESES for the first time. I should also mention that we've got some shorter videos on HESES topics, and again, you can find those on our YouTube channel. You can also find them by the events page, or the HESES page, I should say. There are links, but our YouTube channel is a place where you can go and look at those. We're revising those at the moment, so the revisions are due out shortly. And then finally, I should also say that for more general background on OFS funding, the best place to go to is the Guide to Funding publication, and that's published annually. The current edition is being finalized as we speak and should be out later this month, so look out for that. The best way of staying up to date with what's going on in terms of publications and all the rest of it with the OFS is to use our email alert service. I've put the address here, officeforstudents.org.uk/sign up for email alerts, with each of those words being hyphenated. So that's a useful resource to keep your eyes on in terms of what's happening. So finally, let's just look at what we're going to cover today. And we're going to first look at how to count student years in HESES. And this is to do with start dates and positioning on the workbook. We're going to look at how to make forecasts for both non-completion data and what we call full-time equivalence, FTE. And this is particularly important. We're going to look specifically at what we call the healthcare tables in HESES, because there's certain information that we need about specific pre-registration healthcare courses. And lastly, something new, we've got a new table on degree apprenticeship students. And we need data to help inform the calculations we're going to do to make the funding allocations for that. So that's the territory that we're hopefully going to cover. So let's start on this list and talk about counting student years of activity. Or to use the jargon from the last webinar, we talked about years of instance. So the important thing here is we need to identify which years of instance belong in what we call column 1 and which belong in column 2. So to remind you about what we covered in the previous webinar, which, as I say, you can look on the recording for that, we learned how to categorize our students based on various definitions in the HESES guidance. And we were able to categorize students in a number of different ways. First of all, by mode of study. And that's large. That means looking at them, whether they're full-time, part-time, or sandwich year out students. In the screenshot here, we're showing table 1, which is the one that we use for recording full-time years of instance. And then you'll see this on the other tables as well, but we're just using table 1 as an example here. Within each mode, we can categorize students further. So firstly, we do that by price group. There are 6 price groups which reflect the cost, the course running costs, basically, and these are on the leftmost column of the table. Secondly, we look at length. That's what we call standard or long, and this is determined by the amount of active study in the year. If you remember, the threshold that we talked about last time was 45 weeks. And then we look at level, and we've got undergraduate and postgraduate taught of different types, and postgraduate research, PGR, you can see there as well. And then lastly, we look at fundability status. Home fee students within this OFS fundable or non-fundable, or overseas students. So once we have these categories identified for a year of instance, we can start to look at the columns on the sheet. So let me just move this on. And here we can see, we'll first be identifying whether years of instance should go in what we call column 1. Where are we? There we go, column 1 or column 2, which you can see here, and we'll discuss which one of those to use in a moment. And then we'll look at making a forecast of those years in column 1 and 2 that will not be completed successfully. And these are estimated non-completions, and they will go in column 3. With the information in columns 1, 2, and 3, the workbook automatically calculates the estimated completed years in column 4, and you can see that on the right there, which is one of the main sources we use to calculate funding allocations. So let's go into this in a little bit more detail. At this point, oops, if I can just get the slide to move along. Yeah, at this point, I want to highlight again that when we're counting student activity, we're counting years of instance, which is not the same as a student head count. We looked at this in the last webinar, so go back to that and look at the recording if you need to. So for a student study on a course that meets our definition of recognised higher education, their study can be broken down into a number of years of instance for which they're engaging with a provider. The first year of instance begins when a student starts their study, first engages with a provider. So for example, if a student registered with a university or college and started their course on, say, the 4th of October, that's when their first year of instance starts. Second and subsequent years of instance start on or near the anniversary of this date. So for example, the second year of instance for our hypothetical student who started on the 4th of October 2022 would be the 4th of October 2023, and so on for the following years until they complete their course. The dates here aren't completely rigid. We do allow minor variations for the sort of variation in term dates, but generally we're looking at the anniversary of the start date, so it's important to know what that is. Now, we don't count all years of instance in HESES. They're only countable if all of the following criteria are met. So if a fee is charged, exceptionally, this might be waived on an individual basis, but there's more about this in Annex C, which I suggest you look at if that applies to you. The full-time equivalence, the FTE for the year, is at least 0.03. Now this works out that a student must be doing a minimum of about 2 weeks of activity in a year to be counted. Students cannot be writing up a thesis or dissertation or something similar, a closing piece of work for the whole year of instance. They must be actively studying to have a year of instance counted. And they must not have withdrawn within 2 weeks of starting the instance. We mean here, when we say withdrawn, that they've left the course entirely, and it's not just those who are suspending their studies. Okay, so with that, those concepts in place, we need to look at making sure that we're recording years of instance correctly in the HESES survey. And the key here is to remember that the academic year that a year of instance starts in determines which HESES survey it's counted in. So to show this, we're going to fill in this diagram to represent the study activity of 2 students. One on the bottom row in yellow, and there we go, and the other on the top row in light blue. So looking at these, the first of these is following the more common autumn to spring schedule. The latter, the second one, perhaps is studying on a January to December program, something like that. For them, you can see that their studies overlap academic years, and we'll come back to this idea in a moment. But both students started their courses in the 2021-22 academic year, and they're continuing onto their second years in 2022-23, the current academic year. So what gets recorded where? Well, the first student's year of instance started in the academic year 2021-22, so it would have been recorded in HESES 21. The second student's first year of instance also begins in 21-22, so it too was recorded in HESES 21, even though some of the activity for the student occurs in the 22-23 academic year according to the calendar. It's not split in any way. All of the activity for that student's year of instance will have been recorded in HESES 21. In the following year, the same occurs again. Both years of instance begin in the 22-23 academic year. So again, both the students' second year of instance and both the first student's second year of instance and the second student's second year of instance are recorded in their entirety in HESES 22. So with all of that in mind, let's move on and say that that slide showed the start dates are the important thing to remember when recording them and to work out which goes in which HESES return. But for each return, these start dates are also important in determining exactly where in the workbook tables they go. This is where we get to this idea of column 1 and column 2 that you saw on the screenshot of table 1 a minute or two ago. We decide which of these to use by considering the start date in terms of the census date. Okay, so the census date differs depending on the type of provider involved. So I'll just put a little note of these here. For further education and sixth form colleges and academy, the census date is the 1st of November. For all other providers, the census date is the 1st of December. Now, the reason for this, it's partly historical, but it's also because of different dates of when the individualized student data returns for the different types of provider are due. So for further education colleges, sixth form colleges and academies, that's the individualized learner record, the ILR. For other providers who return data to a designated data body like HESA, for example, in the student or student alternative record instead. But what this means is that to determine whether a year of instances is recorded in column 1 or 2, you need to consider the start date vis-a-vis the census date. So let me just put the census date there. You can see it there. If a year of instance starts, okay, before the census date like this one, then what we're saying is that this is going to go into column 1. If it starts after the census date, and if I can just make my mouse behave, bear with me, there we go, after the census date, then that's going to go in column 2. So essentially we've split your HESES population into 2 groups, those that have begun their year of instance in the current academic year and before the census, or not before the census date, and those that you're forecasting to start in the remainder of the current academic year in column 2. And that's what will usually happen, what will happen for your January or April starters. So we'll take a look at a screenshot in a moment to get this reinforced. But just a final point here, if a student has withdrawn before the census date, they shouldn't be returned in HESES. So for example, if they studied for a number of weeks at a college but withdrew before November the 1st, then they shouldn't be counted in HESES. And this is only if they, as I said earlier, this is if they withdraw entirely from their studies. Suspension of studies with the intent of coming back at a later date, that's a different thing. Right, so let's just have a look at part of table 1. And this is just to show you the structure here. As I said earlier, table 1 just happens to be the first one. We've got table 2 and table 3, which follow the same kind of pattern. And this example, as most providers will, we've got students starting their years of instance between the 1st of August and the census date, so they're all recorded under column 1, and you can see that in the heading there. We use different rows according to the price group and other classifications that they fall under, and you'll remember these are the things we talked about in our last webinar. We also have some students that are projected to start after the census date, and these are recorded in the appropriate rows in column 2. So with the use of columns 1 and 2 for successive years of instance, there's a danger that you need to be aware of. And in order to recognize this, we're going to lay out some ideas about the concept of what we call standard and non-standard years. You won't, I don't think, find this wording in the HESES workbook, but it's a useful way to think about years of instance to ensure that you're returning them correctly. So for us, a standard year is one where all of the activity of a year of instance is contained within a single academic year. So on the screen here is an example of this in box A. This shows activity in 2021-22 for this year that started on or after the 1st of August 21 and was completed before the 1st of August 2022. In the following year, it followed the same kind of pattern you can see in box B here. So again, all of the activity for the year of instance is contained within one academic year. And as I mentioned earlier, you can see here that second and subsequent years of instance start on or around the anniversary of the initial year of instance. So standard years are likely to be the pattern for most students starting in September or October and taking end of year exams perhaps in late May or June or around there. And these are probably all going to be recorded in column 1. Moving on, in contrast to that, Here's a study pattern that is not so common, but it does crop up. So we're going to mention it. It also shows a standard year, but a different type of standard year. This time, the student starts their activity in January after the census date. So that means they're going to be recorded in column 2. But all of their study activity, and again, you can see it here in box A, still takes place within the academic year. And this is what makes it a standard year. Okay, it's all the activity is within the academic year, which we define, by the way, as going from the 1st of August to the 31st of July. So the same is true for the year of instance represented here in box B, which runs from the anniversary of their start date and again ends within the academic year. Now this, as I say, does occur occasionally, but what's much more usual in terms of column 2 students is this kind of scenario. And here we can see an example of a non-standard year. And the year depicted by box A shows that study activity starts in January after the census date. So because of that, as on the last slide, that's going to be recorded in column 2. But what's different here is that students' activity runs from January to December on a sort of calendar year basis. Now, this is just an example, but it's important here to get the point here that their study activity spans 2 academic years. So that's a non-standard year. And the same pattern is repeated in box B there for their second year, which starts in perhaps the January on the anniversary of the first year, and it finishes in December, also spanning 2 academic years. Now, this is where we need to be careful, and on the next slide, we'll see why. So let's just rewind a little bit here. We've seen that the year of instance shown in box A is non-standard, okay, and because of the pattern of study, the student will still be studying on their 2021-22 year of instance on the HESES census date, which I've put in there. What we want to avoid is recording the year of instance for box A in HESES22. This is because in HESES22, we only want to record those years of instance that start in the 2022-23 academic year. Now, HESES22, only this box B, the blue-green box, is going to be recorded in HESES22. This year of instance contains activity starting in January 23 and running through to December 23, started in 22-23 academic year, so that goes into HESES22. Box A would have been recorded in HESES21 in the previous year, as that year of instance started in the 21-22 academic year. So ultimately, the point here is that we're trying to make sure that you're clear about which years of instance belong to which HESES return. And the easiest way, as I say, is to say, okay, when did that year of instance start? Which academic year was it in? And then it goes in the appropriate HESES return. If you're unsure about this, then do please get in touch with us. We'll give the email address again at the end, but it's HESES, HESES at officeforstudents.org.uk, and we'll be happy to straighten things out for you. So at this point, we should be able to identify which years of instance your provider are going to belong in column 1 and which go in column 2. And as we've seen, it's knowing when the year of instance starts and whether this is before or after the census date, which determines which of those it goes into. We just have to make a brief detour, however, here for further education colleges, further education sixth form colleges and academies, because the mechanism for recording years for column 1 is different for them. They have an extra table in their workbook, which is called the courses table. So we're going to have a little look at that now. So for those who won't have this in their workbooks, please excuse us. We're going to just take a brief excursion and look at the courses table. As I said, only further education and sixth form colleges and academies will see this table in their workbooks. Everybody else will just record their column 1 students manually on all the tables 1, 2, 3, and 5, in fact, in the way that we've just described. Now, the screenshot here that I've got is, I'm afraid, rather big. I've had to truncate the image on the right because there are so many columns, but you should get the idea from what here is here and what's not being shown. And we'll zoom in a little bit and just have a closer look. So it all starts on the left here with what we call the learning aim reference, and this has a number of entries on this example, as you can see here. And what happens is you put the numbers into the learning aim reference, and there's a lookup table in the workbook which will get the information which we've downloaded from the learning aim database. So you see that there, and what you can do is then modify the data as you go across the worksheet. So data here under the heading full-time, you can see that we've got the usual kind of distinctions between home fee and overseas, and within home fee, OFS fundable, non-fundable, and also the distinction between UK domiciled and others. And this data is then populated across into the other tables. We've also got sandwich year out that you can see there, and although it goes off the end of the screen, we've got part-time, so it all goes onto this table here, the courses table, and then gets propagated into tables 1, 2, 3, and in fact table 5 as well as we go through. So I'm going to, whoops, just bear with me a second. Yeah, so that's the sort of bird's eye view. Let's actually drill down and recap that in terms of some bullet points. So it's only used by further education and sixth form colleges and academies. It's only used to record years of instance starting on or before the census date, which is the 1st of November for these providers. And so that's the column 1 stuff. The data that goes in here will automatically populate into tables 1, 2, 3, and 5. And those of you who have got students who start after the census date, you will have to put those in manually in those tables in column 2 in the way that we've been talking about. So the main thing here is that data is entered at a course level using learning aim reference numbers, and to achieve this, as I mentioned earlier, we take a snapshot of the data from the ESFA's learning aim database, and that data is used to automatically show course title, level, price group, and length. Some of the data is overwritable, such as, for example, price group splits, which may be different for the way that you teach particular courses, and course level occasionally also needs to be modified. But I think the most important thing I want to leave you is that if you have a course which doesn't have a learning aim reference, you really need to get one as soon as possible. So do tell us about that as soon as you can. HESES, HESES, again at officeforstudents.org.uk, and let us know what progress you're making towards getting the learning aim reference. If there's any incorrect information as well, we'd like to hear about that too. So let's just look at this mechanism in a little bit more detail. And for this, I've just zoomed in to the left-hand side of the courses table here to make some points about it. So here, you must only use the specific learning aim reference for each course. There are limits to the number of times that you can use it. You shouldn't record 2 separate lines with the same learning aim reference for different modes. So as you can see from the slide that we just looked at, you've got full-time, sandwich year out, and part-time modes across the row in different columns. There are occasions, like I say, where you might have to enter the same learning aim twice. Please consult the guidance if you need to do that, so if you need to. There are occasional unusual circumstances where the level may need to change. Something to focus on here is the price groups for each course. Now, these are defined by the learning aim reference, but occasionally we'll find that different providers, things are taught differently, and so those can be amended. When you're doing this, in much the same way that we talked about with price group splits in the previous webinar, you will sometimes find that, people get things where the split that's on the database like this might come up as 50-50 or 40-60 or whatever, and you teach it differently. So you put in 100 and 0 or something like that, or 1 and 99. Now, these are good ways to trigger what we call credibility checks in the HESES workbook. And you shouldn't put in 1 or 99 if that's not the case. You know, do put in the level of activity being taught, and if it's not actually, you know, coming up with what you do, then that's okay. It's likely something that will come up in the data verification process, but we'll take that when we get to, we'll address that, cross that bridge when we come to it. And then finally, one of the other things here is that we're going to have the price group split, as I mentioned before, where figures split should represent the split over the entirety of the course. So we remember in the last webinar, we had an example where it was actually a 3-year course where physics and maths were taught, and there were differing splits in each year. We don't look on having this split done on a year-by-year basis. We ask you to work out what the split is for the whole course and then use that for all different years. Okay, what else can we say? As I say, level and length are infilled automatically, but they can be overridden if necessary, which is unusual, but does occasionally happen. So let's move on, and we'll just look at the other side of the course table here. Looking at the right-hand side here, we can see that there are separate columns, as I mentioned earlier, for full-time, sandwich year-out, and part-time, corresponding to each of the modes. And as we saw earlier, you can see that you've got the same definitions that I mentioned before between fee status, home fee and overseas, and then within that fundability status and domicile. These are all topics we looked at in the last webinar. So there's a column at the end here, and you may not need to use that, but that's for occasions when we might issue a temporary learning aim. That's unusual, but we'll discuss that with you if it needs to be used. And again, it's only here, the courses table for years of instance starting before or on the census date, the 1st of November. And these are column 1 figures essentially, and they will be automatically populated throughout the workbook in column 1 of tables 1, 2, 3, and 5. And that means, of course, that anything that starts after goes in column 2 manually on the relevant table. Okay, there's just one other little thing that we need to talk about in terms of the courses table, and that's when a student progresses, as it says here, directly from one course to another at the same broad level, which is to say something like undergraduate or postgraduate taught. We'd normally consider this to be a single instance for HESES purposes, and this is a typical kind of top-up scenario. So you may have the kind of scenario where, for example, a student's going straight from a foundation year and then goes on to top up to a Bachelor of Science here, or it might be something similar with an HNC and an HND. Here, students are progressing, obviously, but staying at the same broad level, which is undergraduate in this case. And we consider this to be a single instance or engagement with the provider. Occasionally, what happens is that the top-up element overlaps with the year of instance of the lower learning aim, okay? And unfortunately, the courses table can't handle this. So because we see this as a single engagement, we do not want these students to be recorded on 2 separate years of instance. So in this case, you should enter students against the higher learning aim. So that's unusual. As I say, doesn't happen very much, but there are some instances out there. If you think that's you, then do please get in touch with us if you need help with that and clarification. So I think we're now at the point where we can pause and see if any questions have come in. So I'm not quite sure whether I'm handing over to Ross or Graham, but whoever it is, over to you.
It's over to me. I was just trying to start my video. It's taking a bit of a moment. There we go. We've only had 2 questions in so far. The first of which was a question which I think came in ahead of the slides that covered it, whether or not there are any circumstances where a returning student would be column 2. And I think Roger then covered it in his slides that where students are studying on a course, when they first start studying, they're column 2, and then obviously subsequent years they will be returned as column 2 for the activity from the anniversary of their start date. And the other question we've had is about the courses table and who that's applicable to, and that just to confirm that that is only applicable to further education colleges and sixth form colleges and academies, those that normally return data on the ILR and utilised learning aims. Providers who return data to the designated data body that was formerly HESA do not complete the courses table, they just complete the main tables. And those are the only questions we've had so far. So I'll hand back over to you, Roger.
Okay, thank you, Graham. And as we said earlier, if you've got questions, then please put them in the Q&A chat box. Again, if there's something which is particularly complicated or you feel is confidential and you don't want aired publicly, then do please just drop us a line at the HESES mailbox address, which we'll show again at the end of the session. So now we're going to look at column 3. I'm going to look at one of the forecasting elements in the HESES workbook, which is non-completions. So let me show you table 1 again. This is our full-time table, so this will look familiar. So all years that meet the definitions to be counted in HESES22 will have been recorded in column 1 or column 2 of either table 1, table 2, or table 3, depending on their mode of study. So one way or another, we'll have covered all of these in this here. So we know from previous experience that unfortunately some years of instance in those counts will not be completed because students are not always able to complete for various reasons. And we focus on funding the years of instance where students do complete their study intention. So we need a forecast of non-completions to be made. And this estimate of non-completed years goes into column 3 that you can see there. And these are netted against the total years in column 1 and 2, and that gives us the estimate of the completed years of instance for column 4, and that's essentially one of the key areas that we use to gather, to base our funding calculations on for the following academic year. So let's look at the definition of completion for HESES. So we have a very specific definition of completion, which may not be the same as the definition that you're used to thinking about, or perhaps is used in other parts of the HE sector. Our definition states that all students start their year of instance with a study intention. Now, typically, this is a certain number of modules to be completed in that year. For some courses, this will be the same for everybody if all the modules are compulsory, but they may vary if there's a choice. It's important to note that for OFS purposes, that completion for OFS purposes is not necessarily the same as progressing, the progression of the student. The student might well be allowed to progress even if they haven't completed all of their activity, their study intention, I should say, by the end of the academic year or their year of instance. So it's vital to ascertain what the study intention of the students are at the start of the year so that completion can be accurately reported against that. So a defined study intention is needed, and our definition of completion says that in order to complete a year, a student must complete all of their study intention and do so within 13 calendar months of the start of their year of instance. So students can actually complete a module in one of 2 ways. They can undergo the final assessment of the module. This doesn't necessarily mean that they have to pass, but they must undergo it. They must have attended for it to count as a completion. Alternatively, if the oh, sorry, I should have shown that one earlier. Alternatively, if the structure of the module allows, a student can have passed the module without undergoing the final assessment. And this is sometimes the case where the majority of a student's grades come from coursework that's undertaken before the final assessment. As I say, it doesn't have to be an exam per se, it could be a piece of coursework. It's just whichever piece of regularly scheduled assessment would be the last one in the normal circumstances. So again, just to reinforce this, it's vital that the study intention at the start of the year is known so that completion can be accurately reported against that. So next slide. So yeah, in terms of completing the HESES return, because it's an in-year return, most students won't finish their studies for a particular year of instance until well after HESES is finalized. So instead, we ask you to do a forecast, not of non-completions, based on historical data from a number of years. So for example, if last year you had 100 students on a course and 10 of them didn't complete according to our definition, and on that basis you can say 10% didn't complete last year, and you would forecast 10% non-completion rate for this year. So if you had 120 students this year, you would perhaps expect 12 of them not to complete. One little thing to note here is that when you're recording these on the workbook, you need to use negative numbers, otherwise you'll get a validation error. In terms of reaching this estimate, as I say, estimates will probably primarily be based on the previous year's non-completion rates for that particular course, but you should moderate this by looking back at somewhere between 3 and 5 years of data, perhaps weighting towards the most recent years, and this helps to avoid any given year's non-completion forecast from being skewed, as we say here, by exceptional circumstances that might have occurred in the previous year. Now, this is the obvious thing which happened with the 2019-20 data due to the pandemic, and providers may decide to ignore that when they're making their forecasts, as it could well have been anomalous. So when applying our definition, they may choose that to make allowances for that, because obviously there are factors which weren't the fault of the students in that particular year. So a reminder before we move away from this subject: completion, as I say, is not necessarily, in HESES terms, it's not necessarily the same as progression. Do please have a close look at our guidance on this, and forecast, just to reiterate, forecasts should be made on the basis of historical data rather than what you would like to happen or your aspirations. So once we have your data and begin verification, this is one of the factors that we'll look at. We'll compare estimates for non-completion for this year against previous years. If there's a difference, you'll probably find that we'll ask you to explain why you think this is happening. So it might be if you've had a few non-completions this year, it could be you're no longer running a particular course, or that you had a high non-completion rate, which could be bringing down the average. We want you to be able to explain your non-completion forecast. So it's important to have a good idea of where the information it comes from and how it's used to make the forecasts. So that is a little bit on completion and non-completion. Also in the field of estimating stuff, let's now talk about full-time equivalence, FTE, and how that works with column 4A. Now, column 4A only appears on table 3, which is the one which records part-time students. So at this point, again, we'll have filled in data in columns 1 and 2, which we saw earlier, with correct years of instance, identifying which column they should be used by their start date. In column 3, we will have just made a forecast for the non-completions using negative numbers there, and that will occur in those years in 1 and 2. And in column 4, we had automatically calculated for us the net sum, as it were, of the previous 3 columns to get our total estimated completed years of instance. Now, for full-time sandwich year out years on tables 1 and 2, that would be it. But as I say, column 4 is not the last one on this. We need to get to what we call the FTE by using column 4A, which is out here on the end. So you use this to record the estimated full-time equivalent for completed years of instance in column 4. And this is needed because in most cases, part-time students will be studying at a lower intensity or rate than those that are studying full-time. So we need an estimate of how much activity they're doing so that we can provide accurate funding. It's not just done on headcount. So let's have a look at some examples of how we do this. We can calculate full-time equivalents of a part-time course in terms of what the equivalent full-time is. And we can do that in a couple of ways. It could be done on the number of credits studied, or it could be done on duration. So ultimately, of course, the full-time equivalent for a part-time course should add up to the same as it is for a full-time course. And we can look at this in terms of an example. So if, for example, a full-time degree took 3 years and a part-time degree takes 6 years. So 3 divided by 6, 0.5 FTE, and over 6 years, that will give you a total FTE of 3. So all fairly standard arithmetic there. Alternatively, we might have the situation where we're using credit. This does actually give a little bit more flexibility because not all students on a part-time course will necessarily be studying at the same intensity in each year. So in this example, we've got a full-time degree would normally be taken over 3 years, 120 credits are taken each year. In the corresponding part-time course, 90 credits are studied in years 1, 2, and 3, and 30 credits each in years 4, 5, and 6. So what is the FTE for years 1 and 2? Well, you can see that we've got 90, which is what they're doing for the part-time students, over 120, which is 0.75. So if we look now at the full-time equivalents for years 4, 5, and 6, that instead is going to be 30 over 120, which of course gives us 0.25. So the total FTE over the entire course is going to be 3 times 0.75 plus 3 times 0.25, which will add up to give us 3, which again is what we were expecting. So using one of these methods in the 2 examples that we've seen, you can calculate the FTE to put into column 4A. And once that's been completed, you filled out all the information in table 3. And I think at this point, I will say that tables 4 and 5 have similar types of information, but they're going to be split up differently. But we won't spend any time on those today. So we're going to look into table 6 in a minute, which will be the next one after those. But again, quick break here for Q&A. So back to you, Graham.
Okay, thank you. We've had a few more questions come in this time. The first one is a question of whether providers need to calculate a completion percentage per course or one for the whole of the delivery. We do set out in the HESES guidance itself that we note that non-completion rates can vary both by course and by year of course and mode of study. So it's our expectation that where reasonable, providers should factor that in and make sure that's accounted for in the estimates that they calculate for HESES. This also applies because obviously different courses are returned in different price groups, so the non-completion returned against those needs to be reasonable. The next question we've had is from one for newer providers where previous data on completion is not available. How can this be estimated? This is also similar in the guidance where we've got one, it's either for newer providers or for providers where they have new courses. And our guidance is that providers should try and base their estimates on any similar courses that they can get data on to make sure that the estimates that they use in HESES are robust, and that obviously if it came to it and there was an audit, that they've got a basis on which they can present that the estimates were calculated. The next question I'm going to go to, we've had a question about where a student is studying a higher education course at the same time as a lower level course that can be funded by the ESFA. For example, a student studying an apprenticeship and partway through, they choose to study a HE course before they complete the apprenticeship. Should they be including the higher education activity in HESES? The note here is that colleges get a report from the ESFA that highlights that they don't expect them to be claiming funding from both the OFS and ESFA at the same time. This is one that's been a long ongoing issue where we've had senior colleagues here have had various discussions with the ESFA. We do note in Annex B in the guidance particularly about apprenticeships and ESFA funding. Our expectation is where courses meet the criteria to be included in HESES, they should. We do note in particular that there are some circumstances where the funding that we do is complementary to finance provided by others, such as the ESFA and employers for apprenticeships, which is more analogous to finance for HE provision that might be provided through course fees or student support. And obviously our funding is sort of top-up funding on top of that. So in these instances, we do expect providers should be including the courses in their HESES return. So I'm just fiddling around with the last question at the moment. The question we have here is where students are doing extra modules that don't count towards their primary award, such as a part-time student doing 60 postgraduate credits in a year. So in respect of their course, they're doing 0.33 FTE, but in addition, they're doing some extra modules on top. Because they're interested in them, what FTE should they record and how should this be recorded? I'm just going to look up because this one's come in. I might come back to that one because I'm gonna need to find the particular bit so I can guide to the bit in HESES. So I'll pick that up in the next bit of questions later on to give a full response to that one. Okay, so back to you for now, Roger.
Okay, thank you very much, Graham. So we'll wait to hear what you think on that one. And let's carry on then. And what we're going to do now, as I said earlier, is look at what we call the healthcare tables. And that is 6A and 6C. These tables are used to record information about students who are on certain healthcare courses, certain ones which we'll talk about in a moment. I should just add, though, that this year, we used to have a table in the middle here called table 6B, but this year we've removed it from the workbook. This is because nominally it was for sandwich year out health courses, but we never really saw any recorded there, and we don't believe that there are any. If you know differently, then do please let us know. But as we debated long and hard whether to renumber or relabel these tables, but we thought for continuity we would keep them, the ones that remain, as 6A and 6C, rather than shuffle them up and potentially confuse long-standing HESES users. So that is what we mean by the health tables. So moving forward then, what are the tables 6A and 6A, what are they for? Well, on these tables, you'll need to return students' years of instance for those that are on courses which on successful completion lead to first registration as a professional in certain nursing, midwifery and other certain allied health professions. Now, the list of these professions can be found on table 6 in the workbook or in the HESES guidance in Annex L, which is devoted to this subject. Now, these tables don't record all healthcare professions. So, for example, students training to be paramedics or nursing associates are not included in this table. Like tables 1 and 3, they're mutually exclusive and separate the years by mode. So 6A is full-time and 6C is part-time. And as I've just said, 6B was sandwich year out, but we don't think there are any of those. And again, if you know differently, do please let us know. So just to be clear, these students will already have been recorded on tables 1 and 3. So those, for example, on 6A would have gone on table 1. Those going in table 6C should already have been included in table 3. So it's essentially a subset of those tables. But we need these numbers and we break them down in a particular way because the information that we need is useful in terms of these things here: profession, fundability status, and something called starters, which we will come on to. So let's just drill down and see exactly who goes on this table. So to be recorded on table 6, one of the table 6s, a student must meet the following requirements. They must be home fee students, okay? They must be studying on one of the specific pre-registration courses. I already said it's not all of them. The ones that are approved or listed belong, as it were, to a number of different bodies, the Nursing and Midwifery Council, the Health and Care Professionals Council, and the General Dental Council. It's not necessarily all of their courses, but it's those are the ones, those are the regulatory bodies in question in terms of the ones that we are interested in. The best way of getting a proper read on this is, as I say, to use Annex L in the guidance. And this guidance actually provides links to all of those councils' websites and will tell you how to search the courses that come under the definition used here. It's important to note that pre-registration in this context is an attribute of the course, not of the individual student. So if a pre-registration course leads to a first registration for that specific profession, the student is recorded in table 6A or 6C. So let's have a look at it. Again, it's rather a big table. This is just a partial screenshot here, but the structure is similar. We can see here that we've got column 1 and column 2. I haven't put in column 3 and column 4, but it's exactly the same kind of look that you've seen already in the other tables. Column 6C also therefore has column 4A for the full-time equivalents of part-time students. I'll let you look at that in your own workbooks when you get them. So under each of the usual column headings, the analysis is slightly different. Remember, because the health tables are only for home fee students. So we split them here between OFS fundable, non-fundable, and starters. And as I say, we'll come to the question of starters in a moment. The leftmost column is for profession. That's separated out, as you can see there, for ease of completion. And one thing we have done when you actually get your own workbooks is because the table is so large, we've enabled the Excel filtering by profession to allow you to more easily navigate these tables, and that's useful if you've only got 1 or 2 of these to be included in the table. It makes it a bit more manageable. We also have here length and level, as you can see. The definitions that relate to these are the same as we had earlier, but we don't group them on this table in quite the same way. Here we just have all undergraduates and only postgraduate taught undergraduate fee. So with the undergraduates, we don't draw a distinction between level 4 and 5 and other, like we did on the others, and it's only postgraduate taught undergraduate fee that comes under consideration for table 6, although there is this year one exception for this. There may be dental therapy students studying at master's level under the master's loan scheme, so they would be recorded in price group B. But then, you know, the same principles generally apply across the sheet. So returning to the headings under each of these, we can see we've got OFS fundable, non-fundable, and then specifically we want to focus on starters in column, in the column there, starters in 22-23. So using an example, if we were going to record the numbers of one of these professions for students who start their studies before the census date, we'd use column 1, which is what you can see here. Any others would go in column 2. We'd record all students in all years of the course that are OFS fundable in the column that you can see here labeled A. Then we would record all students in all years of the course that are non-fundable in the column labeled column B. And then we've got sorry, I was just checking I've got the right slide here. And then we want to know the subset of all of those fundable and non-fundable students who are starters in 2022-23. So only those who have started their pre-registration course in 22-23, and this is regardless of whether they're OFS fundable or not. Okay, so let's just take a quick look at this question of starters in a little bit more detail. So when we're talking about how to categorize students on table 6, I refer to these starters, and these are recorded in 6A and 6C as starters, and we use that expression because they're not the same as new entrants that we talked about in table 5 last week. These are students who are starting their study for the first time on one of these eligible pre-registration courses, and you need to identify them separately so that we can get a read on these. There might be complications here if any students have to repeat a year, or perhaps potentially if those are transferring. We do get that occasionally between different professions. Annex L is a place to look there for more guidance on that kind of situation. And of course, you can always get in touch with us. So moving into what might be the last lap here, I also want to talk briefly about a new table in this year's workbook, Table 7. And we're asking you to supply details here about degree apprenticeship students. Now, why have we got a new table, Table 7? Well, the answer here is that the government's guidance, which they give us every year, when they outline the strategic priorities grant that we're getting, outlined their desire to further accelerate the growth of degree apprenticeships and to encourage higher education providers to expand their existing offering or develop new ones. So this year we are distributing £8 million worth of funding to support the growth of level 6 degree apprenticeship training programs in 2022-23. And we're using Table 7 to collect data on that provision and in this year. So that data is going to be used to calculate the funding, as I say, is for the academic year 22-23. It will be announced in February. The data used in HESES will be used to calculate the funding for 22-23, and that will be announced in February. And then we've got data as well then for 23-24. So let's look at this in a bit of detail here. I'll just give you a quick look at the table in its entirety. And obviously this is pretty big, so there's a lot, it's hard to see a lot of detail here. I appreciate that. But we'll zoom in shortly and look at this more closely in a second. But at this stage, I really just want to highlight a couple of things. Primarily, first of all, that it's similar to Table 5 that we looked at last time, in that we've got two sections. Section A here that you can see that I've highlighted, and Section B. And as with Table 5, Section B, there is a subset of Section A. So let's now just drill in a little closer and have a closer look. So here's the left-hand part of the previous slide, which shows all of Section A. There's still a lot of stuff here, but you should begin to be familiar with the structure that we've seen here in other tables. And as you can see, we break down the numbers according to mode, although in this case, we do this just between full-time and part-time. You can see price group there as well, and level. And we're looking at undergraduate students here. So we split these in the same way that we saw on tables 1, 2, 3, and 5 in the last session, by using sub-levels for level 4 and level 5 and other. And as you can see, we've got the familiar structure across the sheet we've already talked about today. We've got column 1 for years countable between the 1st of August and the relevant census date, column 2 for those starting after that, an estimate of non-completions in column 3, and column 4 calculated automatically from the first 3. For part-time students, down below there, bottom right, you can see column 4A is open for the appropriate estimated full-time equivalents. And for each of these, you can see that there's a split between OFS fundable and non-fundable students. So let's just look at this in a bit more detail now. Students should be recorded here only when they meet both of these criteria. First, that they're on a level 6 degree apprenticeship training program, and that they have a currently stated qualification aim of an undergraduate degree. Okay, so there are various ins and outs here, but students whose currently stated qualification aim is not an undergraduate degree should not therefore be reported on Table 7. And just as an example of that, let's look at a student who's studying on a level 6 degree apprenticeship program, but who's currently doing a foundation degree with the aim perhaps then of taking a top-up year to get a BSc. So in years 1 and 2, they would not be recorded on Table 7 because their current qualification aim at that point is not an undergraduate degree. And years 3, they would be recorded on Table 7 because both the criteria that we've outlined at the top there would be met, and their current qualification aim is an undergraduate degree. So place to look for all of the detail on this is Annex C in the HESES guidance, and we've also got a video which we're going to post on YouTube, which goes into this in quite some detail because already this is quite a long session. This is just a preliminary look at this for people who may be affected. Strongly recommend you to look at both of those. And we're going to have a little look before we finish at, oh, so yes, that's a bullet there. I thought that had come up, but obviously not. And want to have a quick look here as well at section B. I've removed the section A part in the middle here of this slide, but included the row names and so on from the left of the table so you can see how they extend across. Once again, you'll see the familiar structure of these tables with all the features that we've just talked about: mode, price group level, and all the different columns, and the fundability status subcolumns within those. Now, once again, it's worth actually saying here that we are just dealing with headcount when we're talking about starters, so there's no column 4A for this, but let's just talk about what gets entered here. What goes in section B? Well, section B again is a subset of section A and records starters, different kind of starters. This is for students starting study for the first time towards a qualification aim of an undergraduate degree when they're on a level 6 degree apprenticeship training program. So some things to notice about this. Students classified as starters on table 7 in 22-23 will not necessarily be new entrants on table 5, but those two populations will overlap somewhat. It's also worth mentioning that we think there are some students that have multiple concurrent learning aims, and there might be some finessing to do around that, so please look closely at Annex C and the guidance there, and you'll probably find our videos as well to be useful there as well, and you will find those released very shortly, we hope. They're just going through the final stages of production, and if you go to officestudents.org.uk/HESES and follow the link there for training materials, you will find more about them. So I think that's probably all I want to say about table 7. It's a fairly big subject, and we haven't really got the time to do chapter and verse on it in this session today, but do please have a look at those resources and you will see more about them. Annex C, as I say, is the place in the HESES guidance. So I think we've now gone through most of the content, and I think I can now turn that back over to Graham to see what other questions have come in. Graham.
Yep, we've had no more questions come in, so I'm briefly going to address the previous one, where a part-time student doing a certain amount of postgraduate credits and they're assessed FTE, and if they're doing extra modules on top of that. Briefly in this, we're going to address that particular query separately with the person, but for all providers, one thing to consider is whether or not the modules being completed are part of the same instance or not. Certainly on the HESA record, there is particular guidance under the engagement field that would be worth reviewing on that one. And obviously, once assessed whether or not they are part of the same instance or not, the appropriate guidance on FTE and completion can then be implemented. And one other thing to add at this stage, just to follow up on the previous question that we had about any HE qualifications and courses taken as part of apprenticeships. We do just want to reiterate that those can be recorded in HESES where they meet the criteria set out in the HESES guidance. If any providers, particularly colleges, do have any concerns about that, please contact us via the email addresses, and we're happy to discuss it. But other than that, we have nothing open at this stage. So back to you to wrap up, Roger.
Okay, Graham, thank you for that. So let's just move on here. I just want to show this table to everybody to summarize the places in the HESES guidance document where you can find more information on the various topics that we covered today. So we talked initially about standard and non-standard years, and also latterly about table 7. You can find information on those in Annex C, and Annex D is a place to go for chapter and verse on non-completion forecasting, Annex E for full-time equivalence, and as I think I mentioned, Annex L for details about the health tables. So let's take this opportunity to look back at what we've looked at today. We've talked about how to count student years in HESES, particularly how to count, determine their start date vis-a-vis the HESES surveys that they go into, and then how that affects the correct column, whether it's column 1 or column 2 that they're entered into. We've looked at making forecasts for both non-completions and full-time equivalents, how to make accurate predictions for those two elements, which are needed for columns 3 and 4A respectively in their own tables. We've looked at the healthcare tables, 6A and now just 6C. These additional tables are only relevant for certain providers, obviously, but they relate to specific pre-registration healthcare clauses. And lastly, we've just touched on how to submit data for the new degree apprenticeship table, table 7 on degree apprenticeship students, and this is going to be used to inform the calculations for the new stream of funding to encourage degree apprenticeship course growth. And I will conclude by just pointing out that the next series, the next link in the chain would normally have been our 4th webinar on the submission and verification of the HESES22 workbook. And as I said earlier, due to the recent period of national mourning, we've had to replace this with a recording, which is also just being finalized at the moment, but that's going to look at how to submit your completed HESES22 workbook, and it will talk about the data verification process that we put it through and how we interact with you on that, and then finally talk about how that submission of yours is signed off. And that will be published in the next few days. You can find your way to that from officeforstudents.org.uk/events. Look for the session title there, submission and verification of the HESES22 workbook. In the meantime, you can find out more on other things by, as I say, going to officeforstudents.org.uk/HESES. That's really the sort of starting point for all things HESES related. We've talked a number of times about having a contact with you by email. HESES, HESES, at officeforstudents.org.uk is a place to go to for that. And for not just stuff on HESES, but a lot of other good content about the OFS's doings, have a look at youtube.com/officeforstudents. And that's also where our short form videos on HESES will go when we release the revised versions. So I think that's about all I want to say today. So thank you all for coming. Thank you all for logging on, listening and watching. We hope to see you next year, and wish you well with HESES and the rest of 2022. So thank you very much. Goodbye.